Hey guys, welcome to Safi Mixed. In this video, I'll talk about the addition and subtraction of vectors. Since we can add and subtract vectors both graphically and analytically, therefore I have written graphical over here. That means I'll talk about the graphical addition and graphical subtraction of vectors in this video. We learned from our previous video that vectors can be represented graphically by their representative lines. The length of the line is drawn according to a chosen scale. So if we want to add several vectors graphically with each other, first we need to draw their representative line. That's the first step. So we have three vectors. One vector pointing in this direction, and I call this vector A. This is the representative line of vector A. And then I have another vector whose representative line is this one. And then I have another vector whose representative line is this one. So we have three vectors with their representative line drawn. And remember, we can add these vectors with each other only if they are of the same nature, means their dimensions are same. So these vectors could be a given physical quantity, for example, A, B, and C be representing three different forces. They may represent three different displacement. They may represent three different velocities, accelerations, but if A is force, then BC must be forces. If A is acceleration, then BC must be accelerations. If A is displacement, BC must be displacements. So they must be of the same nature. Now, the procedure for adding them graphically is to begin from any of these vectors. Let me start from vector A. I again draw vector A at this position, and they are in its own direction. And it may not be exactly the same as I'm drawing, but if you want to do it for finding the resultant, they must be in the same directions. Then I put the tail of B on the head of A and draw it in its own direction, like this one. So this is vector A, this is vector B. What we have done, we have placed the tail of vector B on the head of vector A, and then I place the tail of vector C on the head of vector B and draw its representative line in this direction. So the final step is to join the tail of vector A with the head of vector C. One thing more, remember in mathematics in general, the tail is called the initial point and the head is called the terminal point of vector. So different terminologies are used. Tail and head, this is the one that we generally use in physics. In mathematics, initial point and terminal point. So whatever terminology you may use, the procedure is same. And finally, I join the tail of vector A with the head of vector C. Then this vector is the resultant vector, and we write R in mathematical form like R is equal to vector A plus B plus C. Remember, it doesn't make any difference if I start, let's say, from vector C. If I start from vector C, I would have a vector like this. I would have a vector like this. So had I drawn it like this is vector C, this is vector A, this is vector B, I again end up at the same point. So it doesn't make which one vector we start with. So that means the order of addition of vectors graphically doesn't make any difference. The resultant still remain the same. So we can start with A, we can start with C, we can start with B. That doesn't make any difference. Okay, now what is resultant? Okay, now we want to know what is the resultant vector. The resultant of several vectors is in fact a vector that produces the same effect as the joint effect of the vectors that have been added. So that's why we call it resultant vector. And we see the same procedure here, whether I add vector A first or I add vector C plus A and plus B. So that doesn't make any difference. Okay. Now, if we want to, you can repeat this procedure for any number of vectors. You first draw the representative lines of all the vectors, and then put those representative lines on the head of one and the other, and so on, keeping on, and finally join the tail and the head of the first and last vector. Now, in order to understand subtraction of vectors, we introduce another concept we call a vector, negative vector. So every vector may have a negative vector. We write the negative of a vector is a vector that has the same magnitude but opposite in direction. For example, if I want to write the negative vector of A, I'll draw a line parallel to A. So this line and this line, so these two lines are of the same length, and I put the arrowhead on the opposite side to the arrowhead of A. And then I call this the negative vector of A. Similarly, the negative vector of B is a vector that is parallel to B but opposite in direction, and we write it B. The negative vector of C is a vector which is parallel to C, having the same length and pointing opposite to C. So this is minus C. Okay, now if you want to subtract one vector from another vector, remember, this is not necessary that we call A a vector in A a negative vector. It may be so that this is a vector and this be negative of vector. So A and minus A are negative of each other. So if we have given a vector and then another vector, and we are asked to subtract one vector from another. For example, we have given vector A in this direction, and it is asked to subtract vector B from A. So what we would do, we would first put vector A in its own direction, and would then put this vector B on its head in this direction. This would be then, this is vector A, and this is then minus vector B. And then we join the tail of the first vector with the head of the last vector, and this is then A minus B. That is the resultant R is A minus B. This is our R. So in order to find in order to subtract one vector from another, we first need to find the negative of the vector that is being subtracted. So here we are subtracting B from A, therefore I added the negative of B to A. So this way we find the subtraction of vectors graphically. And we can repeat this procedure for any number of vectors. For example, if I want to subtract vector C also from A, that is, I want to find this thing, a resultant of A vector, then subtract B vector, and then subtract C vector. If I want to do this procedure, which I can also write that A minus B plus C. So if I want to carry this, then I need to find the negative vector of B, the negative vector of C first, and draw their representative lines, and then put those representative lines in the order of head to tail rule. We call this addition head to tail rule. So what would then be our resultant in that case? The resultant would be then to add first this vector, this negative of C, to the negative of B. So it could be possibly in this direction, right? This is minus C. And then I join the tail of first vector with the head of last vector, which is a vector C. So then in that case, the resultant, this is our resultant. So this way we use graphical method to add vectors and to subtract vectors. So for subtraction of vectors, we need to find the negative of those vectors that are to be subtracted from those that from a given vector. For example, in this case, we subtract B and C from vector A. And thanks for watching.